The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 9. The Call. Thornton used the money Buck had won for him to pay off some debts. More important, the money made it possible for him to journey to the east. There, Thornton would search for the famous lost gold mine. For as long as anyone could remember, stories had been told about this mine. Many men had looked for it. Few had found it. More than a few never returned. The lost mine was wrapped in a tragedy and mystery. It seemed that an old cabin had always figured in these stories about the mine. Dying men had sworn that this cabin marked the site of the mine. The proof was in the gold nuggets they carried. No living man had such gold, and the dead were dead. So John Thornton, Pete, Hans, and Buck, and 6 other dogs turned east. They sledded 70 miles up an unknown part of the Yukon Trail. They went up the Stewart River until it narrowed into a small stream. John Thornton asked little of man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. Being in no hurry, he hunted his dinner along the way. His load was largely ammunition and tools. The trip was pure joy to Buck. He loved this hunting, fishing, and wandering through the strange places. Day after day, week after week, they would set up camp, build a fire, and eat what they could find. Depending on the hunt, they either feasted or starved. Summer came, and dogs and men rafted across lakes and rivers. Months came and went. Back and forth, the men wound through the vast unknown spaces. In the summer, they shivered through the midnight sun. In the fall, they entered a lake county, sad and silent. They found no sign of life there, only the blowing winds. Through another winter, they wandered over lost trails. Once they came upon an old path in the forest and thought that the lost cabin was near. But the path ended nowhere. Another time they happened upon the wreckage of a lodge, where Thornton found a long-barreled rifle. The men knew the gun had been left there in the early days, but that was all. No hint of the man who had left it remained. Spring came again. The men did not find the lost cabin, but they did find gold. It lay with the sand and gravel left by an ancient glacier. They searched no further. The gold looked like butter in the bottom of their pans. Each day's find was worth thousands of dollars. The men packed the gold in moose hide bags and stacked them outside like firewood. There was little for the dogs to do now. Buck spent long hours dreaming by the fire. He often had visions of following at the heels of a short, stooped, hairy man. The most notable thing about that rough man's world was fear. The man's sleep was restless. He woke up often, staring into the darkness. He searched for hidden dangers as he walked. Buck followed the man noiselessly through the forest. Both were alert to the sounds and smells around them. The man's senses were as keen as Buck's. Their noses quivered, their ears twitched. Along with this vision of the hairy man was the call sounding in the forest. It filled Buck with strange desires. It made him feel a wild yearning, for he knew not what. Sometimes he dashed into the forest as if looking for something. He pushed his nose into the soil and snorted at the earth smells. He hid behind the fallen trees as if to surprise this call. He did not know why he did these things, but he seemed driven to do them. Lying in camp, dozing, he would sometimes spring to his feet. Then he dashed for hours through the woods and open spaces. For a day at a time, he would lie in the underbrush watching the birds. Most of all, he loved running at twilight, seeking the mysterious something that called him. One night, Buck sprang from his sleep with a start. From the forest rose a long, drawn-out howl. Buck's nostrils quivered. His mane bristled in waves. He had heard that sound before. Buck dashed swiftly through the sleeping camp and into the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he slowed down. Cautiously, he moved to a clearing in the woods. Looking out, he saw a long, lean timber wolf. The animal stood erect, with his nose pointing to the sky. The wolf, sensing Buck's presence, stopped howling. Buck stalked into the open, his body crouching, his tail straight and stiff. Every move seemed both friendly and threatening. It was the truce that marked the meeting of the wild beasts. But the wolf fled at the sight of Buck. Buck followed in a frenzy to overtake him. He ran the wolf into the bed of a dry creek, where a pile of timber barred the way. Snarling and snapping his teeth, the wolf whirled around like a cornered husky. Buck circled but did not attack. Buck was 3 times the size of the wolf. The wolf's head barely reached Buck's shoulders. Seeing his chance, the wolf dashed away, and the chase continued. Time and time again, he was cornered, only to repeat the escape. He would run until Buck drew even with his flanks. Then he would whirl around and flee again. Finally, feeling no harm was meant, the wolf turned and sniffed noses with Buck. They became friendly and played about uneasily. After a time, the wolf started off as if going somewhere. Buck followed, and they ran side by side through the creek bed. On the other side were great stretches of forest crossed by streams. Hour after hour they ran. Buck was wildly happy. At last he was answering the call, running by the side of the wild brother. Old memories were returning. Somewhere in the other world, he had done this before. Now he was again running free in the open. The animal stopped to drink from a running stream. Remembering John Thornton, Buck sat down. The wolf started off again. Then he returned to Buck and sniffed his nose as if to ask to follow. But Buck turned around and started slowly back to camp. For an hour, his wild brother ran with him, whining softly. The wolf sat down, pointed his nose upward, and howled. It was a sad howl. As Buck continued on, the howl grew fainter and fainter until it was lost in the distance. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 5, Ghost Dog. For 2 days after his experience with the wolf, Buck did not let Thornton out of his sight. He followed him about his work. He watched him when he ate and slept. But on the 3rd day, he again heard the call from the forest. Now it was stronger than ever. Buck was haunted by thoughts of his wild brother and of the land beyond the creek bed. Once again, he took to the woods, but his brother came no more. Buck listened in vain for his long, sad howl. Buck began to stay away from camp for days. Once he crossed the creek and wandered for a week, but he found no sign of his wild brother. Buck fished for salmon and hunted animals. He killed a large black bear that was blinded by mosquitoes. It was a hard fight that roused all of Buck's rage. Buck's thirst for blood became stronger than ever before. Buck had become a killer, an animal that lived on other living creatures. He needed only only his own strength and skill to survive. Here, where only the strong survived, he was master. He was possessed by a great pride. It showed in all his movements, in his muscles, even in his coat, except for the white of his chest. He looked like a giant wolf. His St. Bernard father had given him size and weight. His shepherd mother, however, had given shape to that size and weight. Buck had the cunning of a wolf, but his intelligence was that of a St. Bernard and a shepherd. He had been taught in the fierce schools of the north. Now he was dreaded as any animal in the wild. Every part of brain and body was keyed to a high pitch. His muscles were as taut as steel springs. He responded to sights and sounds with lightning speed. Never was there such a dog, John Thornton said, as Buck ran out of camp. He's one of a kind, Pete answered. By jingo, I think so, Hans agreed. The men did not see the terrible change that occurred in the darkness of the forest. There, Buck became a thing of the wild. He knew how to crawl like a snake, and like a snake how to strike. He could kill a rabbit as it slept, and watch and catch a chipmunk in midair. Neither fish nor beaver was too quick for him. He killed to eat and ate alone what he killed. As fall came on, moose began to appear in great numbers. They moved slowly into the valleys. Buck had already killed a large calf. Now he wished for stronger and larger prey. He came upon it one day when 20 moose moved into the valley. Among them was a great bull. He stood 6 feet high and had a savage temper. His antlers stretched 7 feet from tip to tip. His eyes burned as he roared at the sight of Buck. A feathered arrow in his side explained his savagery. Buck started to cut the bull away from the herd. He barked and danced just out of reach of the antlers and hooves. The bull charged, and Buck leapt aside. Slowly the bull was lured from the herd. But then the young bulls charged Buck, and the wounded bull returned to the herd. Buck had the patience of the wild. He clung to the herd, driving the wounded bull mad with rage. For half a day, this attacking from all sides went on. In time, the younger bulls grew tired of aiding their leader. By twilight, the old bull stood alone. He watched his mates leave in the fading light. The fanged terror would not let him follow. He had lived a long, strong life, full of fight. In the end, he faced death from a creature that did not even reach his knees. From then on, night and day, Buck never gave the bull a moment's rest. He never allowed him to eat or drink. Often the bull tried helplessly to flee. Buck did not try to stop his flights.
You laughing at?
Instead, he lopped easily at his heels, but Buck attacked the bull fiercely whenever he tried to eat or drink. The bull's great head drooped under the tree of horns. His efforts to escape grew weaker, and Buck found more time to get water or to rest himself. On the 4th day, he pulled the moose down. For a day and a night, he stayed with the kill. Then, rested and strong, he turned toward camp and John Thornton. As he moved, Buck felt a new stir in the land. There was new life in it. It was a life different from the life that had been there before. The birds talked to it. The breeze whispered it. There was a message in the very air he breathed. A sense of disaster weighed on him. 3 miles from camp, Buck came upon a fresh trail. It sent the hairs of his neck bristling. The trail led straight towards camp and John Thornton. Tense and alert, Buck hurried on cautiously. The forest was silent. The birds were gone. The squirrels were in hiding. As Buck slid along like a shadow, his nose jerked suddenly. He followed the scent in a thicket where he found Nig lying on his side, dead. An arrow stuck from either side of his body. Further on, Buck came upon one of the sled dogs thrashing and near death. From the camp came the faint chant of many voices. Crawling forward to the edge of the camp, Buck found Hans laying face down. His body was so feathered with arrows that he looked like a porcupine. Then Buck saw something that made his hairs leap straight up. A gust of rage swept over him. He growled with a terrible ferocity. For the last time in his life, he let the passion rule his reason. Because of his great love for John Thornton, Buck lost his head. The Heats were dancing about the camp when they heard the faint roar, the fearful roar. An animal unlike any they had ever seen, rushed upon them. It was Buck, a hurricane of fury. He sprang at the first man, the chief of the Ehots, and Buck ripped his throat wide open. A fountain of blood spouted forth. With the next leap, he tore wide the throat of a second man. Buck plunged about in the midst of the enemy, tearing and destroying, and so entangled were they that the Indians shot one another with their arrows. A spear aimed at Buck drove through the chest of a hunter. The Yehots fled in a panic to the woods, shouting of an evil. Buck truly was an evil spirit. He raged at their heels, dragged them down like deer. They scattered far and wide. Buck, weary from the fight, returned to the camp. He found Pete dead in his blankets. The earth told of Thornton's hopeless struggle. Skeet lay dead, head and front feet in a stream, faithful to the last. Hidden in the muddy water lay John Thornton. Buck had followed his tracks into the water. No tracks led out. All day, Buck roamed about the camp. He knew death, and he knew that John Thornton was dead. Buck felt an aching emptiness in his heart. When he stared at the bodies of the Yehots, he forgot the pain. At times, he took great pride in himself. He had killed man, the noblest game of all. He stiffened at their bodies. They had died easily. It was harder to kill a husky. Were it not for their arrows and spears, they would be no match. Therefore, he would not fear them except when they carried weapons. The call of the forest came to Buck louder than ever before. Now he was ready to obey. John Thornton was dead. The last tie was broken. Buck was no longer bound to man. Hunting moose as the Yehots had, the wolf pack came to Buck's valley. They poured in a silver flood into the clearing. Buck stood waiting. The wolves were amazed. So large and still he stood. In the moment, the boldest one leaped for Buck. Like a flash, Buck struck him, breaking the wolf's neck. 3 others tried, but one by one they drew back, bleeding from slashed throats. Seeing this, the whole pack sprang forward. Buck whirled on his hind legs, snapping and gashing. He was everywhere at once. Slowly, he was forced backwards against a high bank. Protected on 3 sides, he faced them. So well did he face them that the wolves finally retreated, with their tongues hanging from their mouths. White fangs show cruelly in the moonlight. One wolf, long and lean and gray, came forward. Buck recognized the wild brother with whom he had run. They whined softly and touched noses. Then An old battle-scarred wolf came forward. Buck began to snarl, and then sniffed noses with him too. The wolf pointed his nose to the moon and broke into a howl. The others sat and howled, and now the call came back to Buck. He too began to howl. When they had finished, the pack crowded around Buck and sniffed. Their manner was half friendly and half savage. The leaders raised a yelp and sprang away into the woods. The rest of the pack swung in behind them. Buck ran with them, side by side with his wild brothers. Here may well end the story of Buck. After a few years, the Yeehats noted a change in the timber wolves. Some showed a patch of white fur down their chest. The Yeehats tell of a frightening ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. His cunning is greater than their own. The fearful animal steals from their camps, robs their traps, and slays their dogs. The tale grows even worse. There are Yeehat hunters who fail to return. There are some who are found with their throats slashed. The paw prints left in the snow are greater than those of any wolf. There is a certain valley that the Yeehats never enter. In the summers, however, a certain visitor comes to the valley. It is a great wolf, like and yet unlike the other wolves. He comes alone to the open space among the trees. There, a yellow stream flows through rotten moose track sacks. The wolf stands for a time, howls once, and then leaves. The animal is not always alone. He may also be seen running at the head of a pack through the moonlight. That was the end of The Call to the Wild, adapted version. By Phil LaFair.